Hash pushed from a speeding train at midnight. A cowboy found her crawling and brought her breath back. The rifle was still warm when I set it down. That's the part that stays with me. Not the blood, not what came after. Just that warmth coming up through my palm when I laid the Winchester on the table, like the metal remembered something I was already trying to forget. I've been sitting here 3 hours trying to figure out where to start. My grandson asked me yesterday what the scar on my left side was from, the one that runs from my ribs down toward my hip, puckered and pale. And I told him a horse dragged me through a fence post. He believed it because he's 8 and he wanted to, and I let him because some stories you don't tell until the right time, and some you don't tell at all. But this one I'm going to tell, not for him, for her. Because she'd have wanted me to stop being such a coward about it. There are 3 things you need to know about me before I get to that night, and I'll say them plain because the story doesn't make sense without them. First, I was 41 years old in the autumn of 1899, and I had been alone for 6 years since my wife Clara passed, and in that time, I had become the kind of man who talks to his horses more than he talks to people, because horses don't require anything of you except your honesty, and that I could still give. Second, I worked for the Union Pacific, not riding but maintaining, track inspection mostly, out of a line camp about 19 miles southeast of Rock Springs, Wyoming, which is about as far from anywhere as you can get without falling off the edge of something. There were 4 of us at the camp. Myself, a kid named Dooley who was 20 and homesick every single day, an old Swede they called Gustafsson who didn't talk much and didn't need to, and a mule named Patterson that I liked better than I liked most of the people I'd met in the previous decade. Third, I had decided quietly and without any ceremony or proclamation that my life was mostly finished in the ways that counted. I had work. I had the horses. I had enough bourbon on cold nights to keep the worst of the silence from pressing too hard. I wasn't unhappy. Unhappy requires wanting something different. I'd stopped wanting things different. That was the state I was in. I want you to understand that, because what happened to me is not a story about a man who was searching for something. It's a story about a man who had stopped searching entirely, who had folded his hands and leaned back, and then the world picked him up by the collar and shook him until his teeth rattled. She had that effect on people, I would learn. Even half dead, she had that effect. The night of October 14th, 1899, I couldn't sleep. This was not unusual. Sleep and I had been strangers since Clara, and on clear, cold nights like that one I'd taken to walking the line, just a man and a lantern and the tracks going off into the dark in both directions, gleaming dull like old pewter. There's something about a railroad track at night that settles the mind. The scale of it. It goes somewhere and it doesn't ask you to come along and it doesn't ask your opinion about anything. It just goes. I had my lantern in one hand and my coat buttoned to the throat against the October cold. There'd been frost the last 2 nights, and the ground crackled underfoot, and I was maybe a mile east of camp when I heard the train. Now I knew the schedules better than I knew my own pulse by that point. The 11:40 eastbound freight out of Green River didn't stop at anything until Rawlins, and it didn't slow either, not through our section of track. I'd heard it 100 times. The low growl of it building in the ground before you could hear it with your ears, the vibration coming up through your boot soles. Then the light swinging around the long curve to the west, that great yellow eye swaying with the weight of the locomotive, and the sound hitting you all at once, iron and steam, and the deep, continuous thunder of cars behind it. I stepped off the grade to let it pass, same as always. And that's when I saw her. She was in the brush off the north embankment, maybe 30 yards ahead of me, and I almost didn't see her at all. My lantern caught something, a piece of cloth, the wrong color against the dead grass, pale against dark, and I stopped walking and held the light up and looked harder, and what I saw stopped my blood cold. A woman on her hands and knees in the sage, crawling. Not toward me, not toward anything. Just crawling the way an animal crawls when it doesn't know which direction is safe anymore. Slow and desperate and without a sound, which was somehow worse than if she'd been screaming. The train went by behind me, 60-odd cars of freight roaring past, and she didn't even flinch at the noise. Couldn't. Later I'd understand that she'd gone somewhere past flinching. I ran. I got to her and dropped to my knees in the sage beside her, and she swung at me before I could speak. A wild swing, backhanded, with more force than I expected from someone who could barely hold herself up. and caught me across the cheekbone hard enough that I sat back on my heels and saw sparks. I didn't grab her. I want to be clear about that because it mattered and because I thought about it afterward for a long time. My instinct was to grab her, to hold her still so I could see how bad it was, but something stopped me. Some piece of sense that said this woman has already had hands on her tonight, and she does not need another set of hands on her before she's ready. So I sat back in the sage with my lantern between us and I said, and I remember this exactly, I said, "I'm not going to touch you. I'm a track man. My camp's a mile back. You don't have to go anywhere." She stopped moving. Not immediately. There was a few seconds where she was still on her hands and one knee, her other leg bent wrong at the angle, and I could hear her breathing, ragged, too fast, the breath of a person who's been running even if they're not running anymore. Then slowly, so slowly, she turned her face toward my lantern. I have never in my life forgotten that face. Not because of the damage, though there was damage. Her lip split, her cheek dark with bruising already coming up, a gash above her eye that had bled down the left side of her face and dried there. Not because of any of that. I've seen hurt people before and after. What I've never forgotten is her eyes. Dark brown, almost black in the lantern light, and looking at me with an expression I couldn't name then and can only name now after years of turning it over in my mind. She was measuring me. Right there in that ditch with a broken leg and a face that had been used as a blunt instrument, she was measuring me, deciding something. And whatever she decided must have come out in my favor, because after a moment she sat back on her heels, carefully, catching her breath sharp when the bad leg moved, and she said, "Is the camp warm?" Her voice was lower than I expected, steady, like she was asking about something that didn't much concern her. I said yes. She said, "All right then." And that was the first thing I ever heard her say. "I need to tell you about carrying her, because it matters later." She couldn't walk and she wouldn't let me carry her bridal style. That was the first thing she said when I offered, flat and without apology. "No." So I crouched beside her and she got her right arm over my shoulders and I got my arm around her waist, careful of the ribs, and we went back toward camp like that, half upright, her hopping and me matching her pace, and it took us the better part of 40 minutes to cover a mile. She didn't complain, not once. When she had to rest, we rested, and she'd stand there with her eyes on the ground, breathing through her nose, and when she was ready she'd shift her weight onto my shoulder again without saying anything and we'd go. The cold was serious by then, maybe 15 degrees, and she had no coat. Just a dress that had been good once, dark blue wool, and it was torn from the shoulder down to her waist on the right side, and there was blood on the back of it from where the gravel had taken skin. I didn't ask her anything. Not her name, not what happened, not where she'd come from. I just put one foot in front of the other and kept her upright. Here is what I noticed on that walk. The way she set her jaw when the pain spiked and didn't make a sound. The way she tracked the dark ahead of us, watchful, not panicking, but alert. She was still assessing, still reading the situation, even like that. The way when I stumbled once on a rough patch of ground, she tightened her arm on my shoulder without thinking about it, steadying us both. Like it was a reflex. Like taking care of something was what her hands did automatically even when the rest of her was barely holding together. I thought about that later, a great deal. Dooley was awake when we came through the door. He was always awake, that kid, nerves wound too tight for good sleep. And he came up off his bunk with his eyes gone wide and started asking questions immediately, the way young men do, as if questions were the thing the situation required. I said, "Get the fire up. And put water on." He did. He was a good kid, Dooley, even if he talked too much. Gustafson didn't say anything at all. He just looked at the woman from his bunk, took in the whole of her in one long Scandinavian look, then got up and went to his bag and came back with a bottle of carbolic and a roll of clean cloth and set them on the table and went back to bed. That was the most Swedish thing I have ever seen in my life, and I've thought about it more than once with something close to gratitude. I got her into the chair closest to the stove. She was starting to shake, the cold coming out of her now that there was warmth to come out into, and I got my other coat around her shoulders and pulled a crate up close and started looking at the leg. It was her left ankle. Not the knee, which was what I'd feared from the way she was holding it, but the ankle, badly broken bone pressing wrong against the skin, the joint swollen up to nearly twice its size and already purple in the lamplight. I looked at it for a long moment, my hands on either side of it without touching, and then I looked up at her. She was watching my face, reading it. I said, this needs a doctor, the bone's displaced. I can splint it, but I can't set it. She said, there's not a doctor within 40 miles of here, is there? Rollins, I said, or Rock Springs, both about that far. Then splint it, she said, and don't make that face. What face? That face, she said, where you're deciding whether I'm tough enough to hear it straight. I looked at her for a moment. Then I said, this is going to be very bad. I know, she said. I'll be as quick as I can. I know, she said again. I set to work. She didn't scream. She made one sound, a short, high, involuntary sound when the bone moved, and then nothing. She gripped the sides of the chair until her knuckles went white and she stared at the wall and breathed, and I worked as fast as I could and as carefully as I could, and when it was done and the splint was bound and she let go of the chair, her hands were shaking so hard I could hear them trembling against the wood. I got up and poured the last 3 inches of bourbon from the bottle on the shelf and set it in front of her. She looked at it, then she looked up at me. She said, I'm Nora Vasquez. I said, Cal Briggs. That was good work, Mr. Briggs, she said. Thank you. Then she drank the bourbon in 2 steady swallows and set the glass down and folded her hands on the table, and I think that was the moment I was lost, though I didn't know it then. I didn't know anything yet. I just thought, this is a remarkable woman. Rollins was 2 days by wagon. I went in the morning, before it was fully light, leaving Dooley behind with instructions and a look that was supposed to communicate everything that couldn't be said with Nora 12 feet away on my bunk. And he nodded with his young face very serious and said he understood, and I believe he did. I drove fast. Faster than was good for the wagon, but the temperature had dropped again overnight, and I had it in my head that something would go wrong if I took too long. I couldn't have told you what exactly, just a feeling that kept pressing on me, something urgent that I couldn't name. I got a doctor named Fielding who was a small, fussy man but capable, and I got him back to camp in under 2 days, pushing hard through the second night, and the whole time I drove I kept turning over what she'd said to me before I left. I told her I was going for a doctor and asked if there was anyone I should send word to, anyone who needed to know where she was, family, a husband. She'd looked at me for a moment in that measuring way she had, deciding something again, and then she'd said, there are men who will be looking for me. They were on the train. If anyone comes here asking questions, anyone, don't tell them I'm here. I said, who are they? She said, the men who put me off the train. She said it the same way you'd say the weather has been cold or the well is running low asterisk. A fact, a thing that was so. I asked her how many. 3, she said. Though one of them may be hurt, I got an elbow into his nose before they got the door open. I looked at her for a long moment. She looked back at me patient with her hands folded and her face still, and those dark eyes not asking me for anything. Not pleading, not performing. Just waiting to see what kind of man I was. I said, nobody comes here asking questions. Something changed in her face then, not much, just a slight easing of something I hadn't even noticed was tight. She nodded once and said, thank you, Mr. Briggs. And I went and hitched the wagon and drove through the dark toward Rollins, and I thought about those 3 men the whole way. I should tell you, since I'm telling all of it, what she'd been doing on that train. I didn't learn this right away. It came out over days, the way things come out when someone who's learned not to trust people begins, slowly and carefully, to trust one. You get it in pieces, an afternoon at a time. A detail here, a name there, and then one evening something larger, something that costs her something to say, and you take it and don't make too much of it, and later you think about it when you're alone. Her father had run a sheep operation on the southern end of the Wind River Range, a small one, profitable enough, and he'd died 2 years before from a fever. Her mother had died years before that, Nora had been 12, and she had no siblings. She'd kept the operation running herself for 2 years after her father, which was not a thing the neighboring ranchers were pleased about, partly because they'd wanted the land, and partly because she kept proving she didn't need their help, which seemed to bother them more than anything else. The 3 men on the train worked for a man named Alderman Webb, who had a cattle operation that shared a fence line with her sheep, and who had been trying to buy her out for 18 months. She'd refused him twice, politely, then once more, less politely. Then he'd sent his men to the station when she was coming back from Rollins. She'd been to file papers, legal papers, something about the deed. And they'd gotten her into the last car, and they'd had a conversation about what would happen if she continued to refuse. And when she'd made clear that she understood what they were saying and still refused, they'd opened the vestibule door of the moving train at midnight and put her out of it. She'd tried to roll when she hit. She knew enough to try to roll. But the embankment was steeper than she'd expected, and there was sage and loose rock, and she'd gone down hard, and the ankle had caught something at the bottom, and that was that. I asked her once. This was maybe 4 or 5 days in, when she was well enough to be genuinely annoyed about being confined to the bunk. I asked her whether she was afraid when they opened that door. She thought about it. Actually thought about it, which told you something about the kind of person she was. She didn't answer questions with the first thing that came to mind. She answered with what was true. Yes, she said finally, but I was angrier. I kept thinking about the deed. I just filed it and it was still in my bag, and I thought, if I die out there in the sage, it'll get rained on and the ink will run and all of that will have been for nothing. I said the deed survived. She'd found it in her bag, which had gone off the train with her. The bag had sprung open when she landed and the papers had scattered, but she'd gathered them all in the dark before she started crawling, before she knew how bad the ankle was. She looked at me when I said that, and the corner of her mouth went up, just slightly. It did, she said. I made sure of it. Dr. Fielding set the ankle properly on his second visit. He came back with materials and told her she'd need 6 weeks of it staying still, which produced an expression on her face that I can only describe as volcanic restraint. She thanked him very politely and waited until he was out of earshot, and then she said something in Spanish that I didn't understand, but that Gustafson, who was sitting across the room, evidently did, because he made a sound into his coffee that might have been a laugh. Those 6 weeks were the strangest of my life. There is something about close quarters in winter. The camp was not large. It was built for function and not for comfort. That removes the usual distance between people. You are close to someone in a way that the open range never forces on you. You hear them breathe. You know whether they slept. You know when the pain is bad without asking, because you know what their face looks like when it isn't. She read everything she could get her hands on. I had 4 books at camp. 2 were technical manuals on railroad maintenance. One was a tattered copy of Robinson Crusoe that had been left by someone before my time. And one was a collection of Shakespeare plays that Clara had given me for a birthday one year with her handwriting on the flyleaf. Nora read them all, including the railroad manuals, and when she'd finished those, she read them again, and she had opinions about all of them that she was not shy about sharing. We talked in the evenings, when Dooley had gone to his bunk and Gustafson was smoking his pipe in silence in the corner. We talked about cattle and sheep, about water rights and fence laws, about what the territory looked like before the railroads and after. We talked about the land. She knew that country better than most men who'd worked it 40 years. She talked about it the way you talk about something you love, practical and detailed, and with no need to perform anything about it. She knew where the graze was good in a dry year and where it wasn't. She knew where the water ran underground in August. She asked me once where I was from originally. I said Missouri, a long time ago. She asked what brought me out here. I said a woman and then work, and now just work. She was quiet for a moment, then she said what was her name. Clara, I said. She nodded and looked at the stove. Then she said, she sounds like someone who was worth coming out here for. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. She hadn't been asking me to say anything. She'd been telling me something, which was that the fact of Clara was not a shadow she intended to stand in or a problem she intended to solve. It just was. Clara was part of the shape of me, and that was all right with her. I thought about that for a long time afterward. 3 weeks in was when they came. I'd half expected it. The 3 men, 2 of them in the end, the third either hurt enough to stay behind or smart enough to, rode up to camp on a gray Tuesday morning when the first real snow had come down the night before. I saw them from 100 yards, coming up the cut from the road, and I had about 90 seconds to think about it. I went inside. I told Nora low and quick. She was on the bunk with her leg up, and she moved before I finished the sentence, sat up, pulled her bag close to her, checked that the deed papers were inside. She didn't say anything. Her eyes were on mine, and they were very still and very dark, and she was waiting. I said, stay. She said, Cal. I said, I mean it, stay. She held my eyes for a second, Then she nodded. I went out and closed the door and stood on the step to meet them. They were not impressive men. That was the first thing I thought. The one who did the talking was Webb's man, I figured, foreman type, somewhere between 40 and 50, with a flat face that had probably been handsome once and eyes the color of dirty creek water. The one beside him was younger and harder and didn't talk, just kept his hands loose and his eyes moving, and that one I kept watching. The foreman said they were looking for a woman. Got turned around in the dark a few nights back, gotten herself hurt maybe. They were worried about her, was all, wanted to make sure she was somewhere safe. I looked at him for a moment. Then I said, nobody here but track workers. He said they'd heard there might have been. I said, nobody here but track workers. And if that doesn't suit you, the road east goes through Rawlins, where there's a territorial marshal who's been very interested in some trouble on the late freight out of Green River. The younger man's hands went very still. The foreman looked at me for a long time. I looked back. There's a thing that happens between men in those moments. Not a conversation exactly, more like an accounting. He was reading me, the same way she'd read me out there in the sage, and I think he found something he hadn't expected, because after a moment he adjusted his hat and said they'd keep looking and turned his horse around. They rode back the way they'd come. I waited until they were off the cut and out of sight, then waited another few minutes, then went back inside. Nora was exactly where I'd left her, the bag on her lap, hands folded on top of it, looking at the door. I said, they're gone. She let out a slow breath, just one. Then she looked at me and said, what did you tell them? I told her what I'd said about the marshal, and something crossed her face, quick, there and gone, that I'd have called relief if I thought she'd allow me to call it that. She said, you used the truth like a lever. It was all I had, I said. It's what the best ones do, she said, and something in the way she said it, quiet and matter-of-fact, put a pressure on my chest I couldn't account for. I went and poured 2 cups of coffee and brought one to her and sat down across from her. And for a while neither of us said anything, and the snow came down outside the small window and the stove ticked and creaked with the cold, and that was enough. The 5th week was when I got sick. I'm not proud of this part of the story, but I told you I'd tell it straight, so. It started as a cough, the kind of thing a man working outside in Wyoming in November expects and ignores and keeps working. Then the cough became a fever, and the fever became the kind of thing where you're not entirely sure what is real and what your overheated brain is inventing, and by the 3rd day of it I was no good for anything. Dooley did the work outside. Gustafson did his share and more. And Nora, with her leg in a splint and instructions to stay off it, took it upon herself to ignore those instructions entirely. I remember her at the stove. I remember the sound of it from my bunk, the scrape of the pot, the water being poured. I remember a cool cloth on my forehead in the night that I was too far down to ask about but that I was aware of, dimly the way you're aware of good things when you're too sick to deserve them. I remember waking up once in what must have been 2 in the morning. The stove had gone low and the cabin was cold and dark, and she was sitting in the chair pulled up beside the bunk. I said, Nora, go to bed. She said, be quiet, Cal. Not unkindly, the way you'd say it to someone you were tired of arguing with. I said, you're going to hurt that ankle. She said, I already hurt that ankle. It survived. Now go back to sleep. I went back to sleep. When the fever broke on the 6th day, I was wrung out like an old dish rag, hollow and sore, but clear in the head. And the first thing I was aware of was the smell of something cooking. Actual cooking. Not the camp standard of boiled things and dried things, but something with spices to it. Something warm and complicated. And the second thing I was aware of was Nora sitting at the table, writing. She wrote in a notebook she'd had in her bag. She'd been writing since she was well enough to sit up, and I'd never asked about it, taking my cue from the focused, private way she held the pen. But that morning, when she heard me move, she looked up and her face did something it hadn't done before. It opened, just for a second, and what was there was something I'd call relief, except she wouldn't have wanted me to call it that. She said, you look terrible. I said, I feel terrible. She said, there's soup. She'd made soup from the dried stores and some dried herbs she'd had in her bag, and it was the best thing I had eaten in years. I told her so. She shrugged and said, my mother's recipe, she was from Chihuahua. She said the only thing that could kill a fever was something that argued back. I said, what does that mean? She said, garlic and chili and stubbornness. I sat there eating soup while she went back to her writing, and I looked at her. This woman who had come off a train in the dark and spent 6 weeks in my camp, getting her leg healed and reading my railroad manuals, and arguing with me about water rights and Shakespeare, who had kept the deed papers safe even when she hit the ground, who had sat up with me in the night when I was too far gone to do anything about it. I looked at her, and something settled in me like a stone settling into river mud. Quiet, not going anywhere. I said, "What do you write in there?" She didn't look up. She said, "Everything I need to remember." "Does it help?" Now she looked up. She considered the question the way she considered everything. "It helps me know where I've been," she said, "so I know what direction to go from here." I thought about that. "What direction are you going?" I asked. She held my eyes for a moment. Then she said, "North when the ankle's right, back to the sheep, back to the land." "Back to the problem," I said. "Back to what's mine," she said, and her voice was level and her eyes were clear, and she meant it absolutely. I said, "Alderman Webb isn't going to let you walk back onto that land without another fight." "I know it," she said. "You're going to need," I started. "I know what I need," she said. She said it without impatience. She was rarely impatient, I'd learned, not from weakness but from a kind of deep confidence that things would work out in their proper time. "I need someone who knows what leverage looks like and how to use it. I need someone who can ride and who's not afraid of a fight and who can work. I know all of that. I've been thinking about it for 6 weeks." There was a pause. I said, "I'm contracted through May." She said, "I know. May's 6 months out." "I know," she said again, still writing. I drank some soup. After a while I said, 6 months is a long time to wait on someone." She looked up then, and the corner of her mouth went up in that slight way it had, the way that meant she was not quite smiling, but close enough to make no difference. She said, "I waited 6 weeks in a line camp with a broken ankle and 4 books, one of which was a railroad maintenance manual. 6 months is nothing." I said, "Nora." She said, "Cal." I said, "Are you asking me to come and work your sheep?" She said, "I'm asking you to come and work your sheep." She said *your deliberately and looked back down at her notebook. "If you want them." I sat with that. Outside, the November wind came under the eaves, and the stove was warm and the soup was good, and the whole long quiet of the previous 6 years sat behind me like a road I'd already walked and didn't need to walk again. I said, "All right." She wrote something in the notebook, I don't know what, but her hand was steady. She left for Rawlins in December, when the ankle was good enough, riding a horse I lent her because the wagon would have been too slow and she was done with slow. I rode with her to the edge of our section, and we sat there in the cold for a moment, her horse moving under her and mine still. She said, "You'll come in May." I said, "I'll come in May." She looked at me for a moment. That look, that same measuring look she'd given me from the ground in the sage. And whatever she found must have still suited her, because she nodded once and turned the horse north and went. I watched her go until I couldn't see her anymore. Then I turned back toward camp. Dooley, when I got back, asked me where she'd gone. I said she'd gone home. He said, "You going after her?" I said, "In May." He thought about this, then he said, "That's a long time, Mr. Briggs." I said, "Not particularly." And it wasn't. It was 5 months, and there was work to do, and I did it, and every evening I thought about what direction I was going when the work was done, and knowing the answer to that question made the work go differently. There's a thing that happens to a man when he has something to go toward, when he knows what's waiting and who's waiting and what she looks like when she's made up her mind. The days have a shape they didn't have before. The cold is just cold. The wind is just wind. And the silence that used to press on you like something heavy is just silence, and silence is fine. I rode north on the 12th of May, 1900. It took me 2 days. The Wind River Range was showing its early green, patchy on the upper slopes still but rich and dark below, and the land up there smelled like cold water and new grass, and I rode into it feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time, which was that I was going somewhere I was supposed to go. The ranch was smaller than I'd imagined from how she talked about it. A good house, 2 barns, a working sheep operation that had seen some neglect in her absence, but less than you'd have expected, because she'd had a man watching it, a Shoshone man named Tomas who'd worked for her father and stayed on from loyalty. He nodded at me when I rode in. The kind of nod that communicated nothing except acknowledgement, which was exactly the right amount. She came out of the house when she heard the horse. She was walking straight, the ankle healed, and she was wearing her work clothes, heavy trousers and a shirt and her hair up. And she looked exactly like herself, which was to say formidable and direct, and somehow, in the clear May light, more herself than she'd been in the lamplight of the camp, if that was possible. She said, "You're a day early." I said, "The weather held." She looked at me for a moment, then she said, "There's coffee." I tied the horse and followed her inside. There were papers on the table, legal papers, the kind with stamps on them. I looked at them without touching. She said, "The marshal in Rawlins was interested after all. Alderman Webb has a problem with a judge in Cheyenne right now that's taking up most of his time. He may have another one coming from the territorial office, depending on how things go." I said, "You've been busy." "I told you I'd been thinking for 6 weeks," she said. She poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of me. "The deed's clear. The operation's mine and nobody's challenging it right now. There's still the fence on the south boundary that he cut last year, which needs fixing, and there's a water question on the east pasture that we'll have to address before August." I said. She was looking at the papers when I said it, and when I said it, she looked up at me. She said, steady, plain as anything. I picked up the coffee cup. Outside the window, across the yard and beyond the nearer barn, the Wind River foothills went up into the pale blue sky in their long green waves, and the sheep were somewhere out there in the grass, and somewhere there was fence to fix and water to sort out and work to do, and the coffee was good, and she was sitting across the table from me with her hands folded and her eyes clear, and that was the whole of it, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. That's the story, that's all of it. My grandson asked me about the scar, and I told him a horse dragged me through a fence post, and that's not entirely wrong. There was a horse involved, eventually, and there was a fence, and the south boundary took us the better part of a summer to set right, and there were other things before the land settled and the legal troubles dried up, things I don't need to go into here. But the scar on my side is from a different night, a different year, and that's another story, and the only reason I'm still here to tell any of it. The only reason I made it past the winter of 1899 and came out north in May, and fixed that fence and argued about water rights with a woman who was right about almost everything and never let you forget it, is because she sat in a chair beside my bunk at 2 in the morning when the fever was bad and the fire was low. Because she made soup from her mother's recipe and told me garlic and chili and stubbornness. Because she chose to trust me out there in the sage when she had every reason in the world not to trust anybody, and what she found when she looked at me was worth staying for. She saw something in me on that embankment that I'd stopped seeing in myself, and then she waited with all the patience in the world for me to catch up. I've been catching up ever since. The rifle's cold now, the lamp's burning low. Outside the window the hills are the same hills they always were, and the sheep are in the east pasture where they always are this time of year, and somewhere in the house behind me there is the sound of a pen moving across paper, a woman writing down what she needs to remember so she knows what direction to go. I already know my direction. It's been the same for 26 years. And